They gave my sister everything. $10 million the house, even the family dog. Then they grabbed me by the hair and dragged me down the front steps like I was some stranger. But I didn't scream. I didn't beg. Because I had a plan. And when it was over, they didn't just lose the money. They lost me. This isn't just a revenge story. This is how you rise when no one picks you. Rachel Miller was the kind of woman people described as put together. At 38, she had the kind of life that looked enviable from the outside, an elegant home tucked into one of Portland's quiet, tree-lined neighborhoods, a husband who could charm dinner guests and judges alike, and the kind of financial stability that allowed her to choose comfort over career. She drove a pearl-white Audi, taught yoga on weekends when she felt like it, and posted scenic brunches and curated smiles. If anyone had asked her, she would have said she was content, maybe even lucky. Ethan Miller was part of that illusion. No, he was the centerpiece. A partner-track attorney at a boutique firm, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had always known the world would bend for him. He opened doors for strangers, called his mother twice a week, and had a knack for remembering people's names. To outsiders, he was the husband women hoped for: steady, successful, well-mannered. He praised Rachel in public. "She's the one who makes our house a home," he'd say at company dinners, reaching over to squeeze her hand just tight enough for the cameras. But the pressure of that hand didn't always loosen behind closed doors. Rachel had once been an interior designer. Before Ethan's career began its steep ascent, she had her own firm, small, local, but fulfilling. She loved coaxing personality out of spaces, layering color and texture into warmth. Clients trusted her taste. She was known for soft lighting and sharp instincts. But when Ethan's firm relocated him and offered a fast-track promotion if he could focus without distractions, they'd agreed together that she would step back for now. That was 6 years ago. It's just temporary, she had told herself, sipping wine in a moving box-filled living room of their new Portland home. "I'll take a break. We'll settle in then. I'll start again." Ethan had kissed her forehead and said, "You're amazing for doing this, babe. You won't regret it." She hadn't regretted it at first. The house was beautiful, the city vibrant, and the rest had felt manageable. Until slowly and visibly, it didn't. Her days shrank. At first, she filled them with design boards, then volunteering, then home projects. But something inside her felt quietly shuffled to the side like an end table in the wrong corner there, but no longer part of the room's story. Ethan was always busy. Court filings, late meetings, partners to impress. At home, he was polite, efficient, and emotionally distant. He praised her cooking when he noticed it, but more and more often, dinner became a solo affair. What stung more than the loneliness was how subtly it was wrapped in condescension. Why go back to work? "We don't need the money," he said once when she brought up reopening her business. "You should enjoy this time. Relax a little." "But I miss it," she replied, choosing her tone carefully. He looked up from his phone, flashed a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and said, "You're so good at making things nice around here. Honestly, you've got a dream life. Let's not complicate it." It was always like that, smothering concern disguised as care. She began to second-guess herself. Was she being ungrateful? Needy? Was she making up the sense that something had shifted between them? What she didn't say that she'd stopped feeling like a woman and started feeling like an ornament, polished, displayed, and silently ignored. The friends she once had in the city had either moved or faded out. Ethan didn't like couples where the men weren't on his level. And Rachel had grown tired of always being the one reaching out. She had a few acquaintances from yoga, the kind who chatted after class but never called. Her phone had grown quieter over the years, just like the parts of her that used to speak up. Still, Rachel kept the house in perfect order. She had pride in that. She knew Ethan noticed even if he didn't say it often. The floors gleamed, the sheets were crisp, every drawer had a system. There was a peculiar comfort in control even when everything else felt like it was slipping sideways. She kept a journal too, only half-filled, usually abandoned, for months at a time. But one entry she'd written recently gnawed at her. It read, I don't think I'm unhappy, but I also don't think I'm in the picture anymore. I'm the frame. It was a strange metaphor, but it had come out quickly like a truth she hadn't known she believed until it hit the page. Lately, she had started waking up at 3:00 a.m. for no reason. Wide awake, heart beating too fast. She would lie there beside Ethan, listening to the sound of his slow, even breathing, and wonder why it felt like a stranger was in her bed. There was nothing overtly wrong. He wasn't violent, wasn't cruel. He didn't cheat, or at least she didn't think he did. He was just absent. A beautiful shell of a man who kissed her on the forehead and said, "You're amazing," while slowly emptying her from the inside out. Rachel had begun to suspect that what looked perfect wasn't whole, but she couldn't explain why not yet, not even to herself. Still in the quiet early mornings when the house was dark and her stomach twisted with something she couldn't name, she'd feel it. Something was off, and deep down a voice that used to whisper had started to speak with clarity. "You're not imagining this. This time, trust your instincts." At first, the changes were small, so small they could be dismissed if Rachel hadn't already been listening to that quiet voice inside her chest, the one that whispered things weren't as seamless as they seemed. Ethan's travel schedule picked up. His firm was expanding, he said. More meetings, more networking events, more last-minute trips to Seattle or San Francisco. When she asked why she hadn't heard about them earlier, he smiled as if it were a silly question. "I didn't want to worry you. These things pop up all the time. You used to love when I traveled, you got the whole bed to yourself." He always deflected with charm humor or a veiled jab. And for a while, Rachel played along, telling herself he was just busy, that all high-powered jobs had seasons like this. But the trips kept increasing, and the intimacy between them faded in equal measure. Conversations became transactional. Sex had turned from warm and familiar to mechanical if it happened at all. His phone was always face down now, at dinner, on the nightstand, even in the bathroom. It used to sit open on the counter while he brushed his teeth or brewed coffee. Now it followed him everywhere, clutched like a secret. One evening, Rachel caught a glimpse of a message notification as he hastily swiped it away. The name was just an initial L, but she saw the emoji, a champagne glass. Later that night, she asked softly, "Everything okay at work?" Ethan didn't even look up from his laptop. "Why wouldn't it be?" She shrugged, folding laundry with hands that moved slower than usual. "You just seem distracted lately." He closed the laptop, exhaled heavily, and stood. "Rachel, I've got a lot on my plate. The last thing I need is paranoia at home. We're good. Okay, don't create drama where there isn't any." There it was, that subtle twist, the suggestion that she was imagining problems, that her instincts were flaws, not signals. Gaslighting, her therapist would have called it. They hadn't been in therapy for years. Ethan said it was a waste of time to pay someone to tell us what we already know. But now in moments like these, Rachel wondered if maybe they didn't know anything at all. The more she looked, the more she found cracks. He'd always been the one to handle the finances. In the early days, she didn't mind. She had never liked spreadsheets and was relieved when he said he'd take care of the boring stuff. But now, something about that arrangement felt suffocating, disempowering. She tried to log into their shared bank account one day to check a utility charge. The password didn't work. She tried again. Still wrong. Later that evening, she brought it up casually. "Hey, did you change the password to the Chase account I couldn't get in?" Ethan looked up from his tablet, slightly annoyed. "Yeah. There were some phishing scams going around. I updated all our logins. I'll text it to you later." He never did. The next week she asked again. He laughed and kissed her on the forehead. "You're lucky you don't have to worry about this stuff. You've got the dream set up. Let me carry the stress." She smiled reflexively, but felt something coil in her stomach. It wasn't just about the password. It was about access, about being treated like a dependent, not a partner. Still, she didn't push yet. A few days later, Ethan came home holding a manila folder, his face lit with enthusiasm. "Hey, so I've been talking to our accountant. We should think about consolidating all our assets' retirement property accounts into a single trust. Helps with tax efficiency. Rachel hesitated. What kind of trust? Just a basic revocable living trust. Makes estate stuff easier. You know, in case anything ever happens to either of us. His tone was breezy, but the folder stayed clutched tightly in his hands. He spread out documents on the kitchen island pages of legal text, financial terms, signature lines. Her name appeared multiple times. So did his. Some of it looked standard. But Rachel had spent years designing contracts for high-end clients. She knew the trick was always in the fine print. Something felt off. She skimmed one page, then another. On the third, she saw a paragraph about sole managing authority. Her name was listed once in the beneficiaries section. "Can I look this over tomorrow?" she asked, masking the unease in her voice. "It's just paperwork, babe. If you'd rather read every word, be my guest." He chuckled, as if she were being adorable. She took the papers to bed that night and stayed up until 2 a.m., cross-checking every line. She didn't sign. The next morning, she handed back only 2 signed forms, the harmless ones. The rest she left blank. Ethan never followed up, and that silence confirmed more than any confrontation could. Days later, while searching for an old tax document in the drawer where Ethan kept miscellaneous mail, Rachel stumbled on a bank statement. The header made her pause. Private Wealth Management, individual account, Ethan Miller. She didn't recognize the institution. The account had substantial deposits, $12,000 last month, $6,500 the month before. Transfers in. No joint withdrawals. Rachel's palms began to sweat. She opened his laptop that evening, after he'd gone to bed, one of the few times he didn't take it into the room with him. A browser tab had been left open. A partially typed email, Lauren, "I'm moving forward. The assets will be under my name soon." She's not asking questions. Rachel sat back. A sound left her lips, half laugh, half sob. Not from heartbreak, from confirmation. This was no longer about suspicion. It was real. And it was time to stop pretending. The words weren't meant for her. Rachel hadn't meant to overhear anything. It was nearly midnight, and she'd padded downstairs barefoot for a glass of water. The house was dark, except for a low light coming from Ethan's office. The door was cracked. She could hear him pacing soft, deliberate steps on the oak floors he'd insisted were worth the price. She heard his voice, low, steady, rehearsed. "She won't know until it's done. I've handled everything. All she has to do is sign." Rachel froze. The glass in her hand remained empty. "No, trust me. She doesn't ask questions. That's the benefit of a low-maintenance wife." The silence that followed was worse than noise. Her breath caught. She stepped back slowly, careful not to creak the floorboard near the pantry, then retreated upstairs, heart pounding in her throat. In one sentence, Ethan had confirmed everything she hadn't wanted to believe. This wasn't just an affair. This wasn't midlife restlessness. This was strategy. This was betrayal in its most curated form. The next morning, Rachel was a ghost inside herself. She made coffee, kissed Ethan goodbye like always, and waved from the porch as he pulled away. Then she shut the door, locked it, and slid to the floor. She allowed herself 10 minutes of free fall. Then she stood, grabbed her laptop, and started searching. The lake house had always been in both their names. It was a modest property 2 hours outside the city, quiet, peaceful, a place they once dreamed of retiring to. They had bought it during better years. Rachel remembered picking out the weathered white rocking chairs on the porch, the way Ethan laughed when she insisted on hand-woven blankets from a local artisan. Now buried in county property records, she saw something new. A transfer. Executed 3 weeks ago. The document showed her electronic signature, but Rachel had never signed anything. She scrolled down. Ethan had filed a quitclaim deed transferring sole ownership of the lake house to himself. Her name had been removed. The notary's stamp was there. Her signature forged. She stared at the screen, nausea twisting in her gut. A cold, unreal sensation crawled through her spine. It was the feeling of seeing your life hacked into from the inside. And he'd done it with complete calm. She thought of the way he kissed her on the forehead that same week, the way he said, "I love how you trust me." The way he tucked her into bed before leaving for his supposed client dinner. The way he smiled when she brought him coffee the next morning. It was like watching a movie of her own life in reverse, every affectionate gesture becoming retroactively poisoned. Rachel didn't scream. She didn't cry. Something in her had already shifted. She began gathering. First, she printed every file she could find from the county clerk's office. Then she opened Ethan's filing cabinet, the one he thought she never used. Behind a stack of old tax returns, she found a folder labeled Estate Docs. Inside were copies of the same property transfer and a draft of a living trust, just like the one he'd casually mentioned at the kitchen counter. Only this one named Lauren Mitchell as a personal executor in the event of his incapacitation. Lauren, the L, the champagne glass emoji. She had a name now. Rachel took a deep breath and scanned her phone for contacts she hadn't called in years. One name stood out: Danielle Rhodes, a law school friend of Ethan's, who had once told Rachel, "If he ever starts pulling that 'you don't need to worry about money' crap, you call me." Rachel called her. Danielle answered on the second ring, her voice cautious but warm. "Rachel, wow, it's been a while." Rachel got straight to the point. "I need a lawyer, someone who understands marital asset fraud and forgery. And I need you to keep this quiet." Danielle didn't hesitate. "Come to my office tomorrow. Bring everything." For the rest of the day, Rachel moved through the house like a surgeon, careful, intentional, clinical. She downloaded account summaries, took photos of Ethan's handwritten notes, emailed documents to an encrypted drive under a fake name. That night she laid beside Ethan in bed. He snored softly. His phone buzzed once. She didn't reach for it. She didn't need to anymore. She already knew. What struck her wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the confidence. Ethan had been so sure of her compliance, so certain she would never look, never question, never act. He had mistaken her silence for blindness, but Rachel wasn't blind. She was awake now. The next morning she began cataloging everything. A timeline of changes in passwords, a list of financial behaviors she had been excluded from, every conversation she could remember where he gaslit her about stress and letting him handle things. She also called the notary listed on the property transfer. "Oh yes," the woman said. "I notarized that for Mr. Miller last month. His wife signed digitally, she wasn't present." "You're sure it was me?" Rachel asked. "Well, that's what he said. I assumed it was legitimate." Her stomach turned. Ethan had walked right through the system, and yet he'd underestimated her. Rachel still didn't confront him. She cooked dinner, made jokes, sent him funny videos. She let him believe he was still in control. But every night she added to the folder in her encrypted drive. She named it Exit. She wasn't running. She was building the door. And soon, she'd walk through it alone, and with everything he tried to take from her. Danielle's office was tucked inside a brick building in the Pearl District. It looked more like a loft gallery than a law firm's sleek, sunlit quiet. Rachel sat on the leather couch across from her old acquaintance, hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a pale blue cashmere sweater and nude lipstick, the kind of look that said, "I'm composed." She had chosen it intentionally. Danielle closed the folder she had been reviewing. "This is bad, Rachel. Really bad, but not irreversible." Rachel nodded. "How many women have you seen go through this?" Danielle leaned back. "More than I should have to. They trust their husbands, let them handle the finances. Sign papers without asking questions. And then when things unravel, they're shocked to find they legally own nothing." Rachel's jaw tightened. "He forged my signature. On legal documents." Danielle gave a grim smile. "That's what makes this different. We can work with that." They built a quiet plan, one rooted in evidence, timing, and absolute discretion. Danielle advised her to gather everything: bank records, digital footprints, email exchanges, anything that painted a picture of Ethan's financial manipulation. "Do not confront him," she warned. "Not yet. He's already ahead in the narrative. Our job is to rewrite it before he realizes." Rachel left the office both shaken and sharp. She walked to her car slowly, the fall wind catching her coat, as if nudging her forward. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her mind was clear. It was the first time in months she felt like she was moving with purpose, not just surviving. At home, she began the process. She started small checking emails, searching terms like trust account asset transfer and Mitchell Holdings, the firm linked to Ethan's mystery deposits. She copied files onto a flash drive she hid inside an old perfume box. She took photos of documents with her phone and uploaded them to a cloud storage account she created under a pseudonym. Next came the finances. She opened her own bank account at a credit union across town. No joint access, no digital link to Ethan. She used her maiden name on the paperwork and rerouted all automatic withdrawals, subscriptions, insurance, phone bills to her new account. She even applied for a credit card in her name only. For the first time in years, she saw her own financial footprint begin to reappear. But the real turning point came when Danielle connected her with a forensic accountant named Monica Park, a calm, brilliant woman in her 50s who had built her career uncovering financial deceit within marriages. Monica wasn't shocked by what Rachel shared. 80% of these cases look just like yours, she said. Clean credit educated woman husband handles everything. And one day, she wakes up erased. It took Monica less than a week to trace irregularities. There's roughly $80,000 missing from your joint retirement fund, she explained in their second meeting. Small, consistent withdrawals masked as tax payments, all rerouted to a private wealth account in his name. Rachel blinked. How far back does it go? Monica shrugged. About 2 years. He started slow. The bigger transfers began this spring. Rachel stared at the statement. That money had been meant for their future lake house summers, a trip to Greece, maybe early retirement. She pictured Ethan smiling at dinner while taking that future piece by piece behind her back. But she didn't cry. She smiled. At home, Rachel played her role flawlessly. She packed his favorite turkey avocado wraps for lunch and left sweet notes in his briefcase. You're going to kill it in court today, XO. She complimented his suits, ran hot baths on Friday nights, asked about his day. She even left the folder of unsigned documents where he could see them. When he asked about them again, she simply said, "Oh, I'll get to it soon," with a light, airy tone. He believed her. Of course he did. Because for Ethan, she had never been a threat. She had been the background, the supportive wife, the pretty smile beside him at galas, the warm dinner waiting at home. She wasn't anymore. Every night she added to her case screen captures of suspicious messages, emails sent to Lauren, even voice memos she recorded when Ethan talked in vague legalese about finalizing asset transitions. She organized everything in folders with labels like trust transfer, fraud, financial isolation, and digital evidence, text threads. Her cloud drive became a digital fortress backed up twice, one version encrypted another, stored on an offline drive, hidden in the lining of her old travel bag. She also visited a counselor someone Danielle recommended, not because she was falling apart, but because she didn't want to fall back into pretending. They spoke about power identity, silence, and rage. You're not here to fix a marriage, the therapist said gently. You're here to recover a self. Rachel nodded. And I think she's waking up. In the evenings, Ethan would curl beside her, touch her shoulder, mutter something about depositions and deadlines. She let him. She laughed at the right moment's feigned concern over his workload, even suggested they take a weekend trip soon. But behind her soft eyes was steel. Rachel didn't fantasize about confrontation. She didn't want a scene. She wanted clarity. And she wanted everything he tried to steal returned plus interest. Some nights she'd stand in front of the bathroom mirror after brushing her teeth, just staring, practicing stillness, memorizing the face of a woman who once believed love and loyalty would protect her, and now knew better. Not colder, just wiser. Not louder, just sharper. She would wait until the day came quiet and final, when her soft voice would be the one delivering the blow. It happened on a Friday, as Rachel always knew it would. Ethan liked to handle difficult conversations on Friday's weekend, buffer less suspicion. His logic was that people processed hard truths better when they had 2 days to forget them. She heard his car pull into the driveway at 6:41 p.m. sharp. Not the usual 7:30. Not the got stuck at the office excuse he used when he needed to avoid small talk. That alone told her this was planned. She set down the tea she hadn't been drinking and moved to the door before he rang the bell. He smiled as if nothing was wrong. "Hey, babe." He kissed her cheek, quickly, too quickly. His arm was stiff around her shoulder. And then she saw it, the manila envelope tucked under his arm. A thick one. "Got something for you?" he said, tone light but eyes alert. He laid the envelope on the kitchen island like a magician presenting the final card in his trick. "These just need your signature," he said, pulling out the top page and flipping through casually. "We're restructuring everything for the next phase. Consolidating assets, finalizing the trust, streamlining the estate." She glanced at the stack. 30, maybe 40 pages. "You've been busy," she said calmly. "Yeah." He exhaled, relieved. "It's been a lot. But once this is done, everything will be cleaner, safer, protected. Protected," she repeated. "From what?" He smiled. "Just life. You know, lawsuits, taxes, surprises." She took the stack, sat down slowly, and began skimming the top document. It was labeled Revocable Living Trust. Amended structure. She had seen something similar in the drafts she had found weeks ago. "It's pretty straightforward," Ethan added. "Most of it's boilerplate, just signatures where I've flagged." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a pen. It was black, sleek, expensive, engraved with his initials. He laid it beside her like a loaded weapon. Rachel picked it up, uncapped it. She turned to the next page and then another. There it was, Clause 8.2, Financial Authority Transfer. "In the event of asset restructuring, full managing control shall rest with the named executor Ethan Miller. Spouse authorization shall be deemed implicit unless explicitly revoked in writing within 30 days of execution." Her heart slowed, not sped up. He was trying to make her authorize a power of attorney transfer hidden in vague legalese, giving him full control over their assets under the guise of streamlining. There were deed changes buried 10 pages later. Her name was listed, but the rights were temporary, set to expire in the event of divorce, death, or mental incapacitation. She flipped to the final page. Signature of Rachel Miller, Dalhatatang. She looked up. Ethan was leaning against the counter, arms folded like a man watching the final piece fall into place. He smiled. Rachel smiled back. "Can I look these over tonight?" she asked. "Just want to read every word." He hesitated, then chuckled. "Sure, if you want. I mean, we've already gone over most of this with the accountant." "I'd still like to," she said sweetly, standing and placing a hand on his chest. "You know me. Overthinker. You're cute when you're cautious," he said, kissing her forehead. That night, she sat at the dining table with the documents spread in front of her. She made marks with a red pen, circled clauses, wrote questions in the margins, and then she took photos of every single page, each one uploaded to her secure drive. Then again to a second copy on a password-protected flash drive. She made herself chamomile tea, turned on soft jazz, and waited for Ethan to fall asleep. At 10:30 p.m., she stepped onto the back patio, phone in hand. Danielle picked up on the first ring. "He made his move," Rachel said. Danielle didn't miss a beat. "You didn't sign?" "Of course not." "Good," she said. "The timing's perfect. We've got the foundation. Now we initiate." They laid out the steps, filing for a temporary injunction, a cease transfer order, emergency motion for asset freeze, a restraining order if needed. The case file would be submitted Monday morning. Rachel went back inside and tucked the envelope back into its folder. She slipped it into Ethan's briefcase for show. Let him think she was compliant, that she was still asleep. She climbed into bed beside him. He stirred, mumbled, "Get it all signed," she whispered. "Almost." He exhaled satisfied and rolled over. She stared at the ceiling, pulse steady. That weekend, Rachel was more affectionate than usual. She cooked him breakfast. They took a walk around the neighborhood. She even laughed at his bad joke about one of the junior associates at his firm. Ethan looked relaxed, victorious. He had no idea he had already lost. Monday morning, he left the house like every other day. By 9:00 a.m., he'd be served at the office first the injunction, then the freeze order, and finally the subpoena. Everything he had maneuvered, every false signature, every misfiled deed and hidden transaction, would be documented and exposed. Rachel sat in the quiet kitchen, sipping her coffee. The pen he had given her sat next to her cup, uncapped, untouched. He had handed her the trigger thinking she'd never pull it. But the trap was already sprung. And now it was his turn to fall. Monday morning in Ethan's office started with coffee and confidence. He arrived in a navy suit, crisp as ever, greeting the receptionist with that lawyerly charisma he'd refined over years in courtrooms. He had a partner meeting at 10 and a lunch scheduled with a real estate broker at noon one who didn't know yet that she was meeting a man who thought the world was still in his hands. At 9:17 a.m., the first envelope arrived. Ethan Miller, the man asked, holding out a manila folder marked Private and Urgent. Ethan blinked instinctively, reaching for it. Yes, that's me. By the time the third envelope landed on his desk, notice of emergency motion marital asset. Injunction, his assistant's eyes were wide. He shut his office door and sat down, flipping through the documents like they were fiction. They weren't. The first served him with a temporary financial freeze halting all transactions, transfers, or access to shared or disputed assets. The second contained a petition citing forgery, misappropriation, and marital fraud. The third, a preliminary hearing date, that Friday. And there in black ink, woven throughout every page, was the name he thought Rachel would never discover. Lauren Mitchell, listed under co-beneficiary, unauthorized executor, and person of interest in suspected collusion. By 10:00 a.m., whispers had started. His assistant wouldn't meet his eyes. Another junior associate paused too long at the copier outside his door. Ethan tried to act unbothered, but his knuckles were white around his coffee mug. He canceled his lunch meeting. He texted Rachel 3 times. She didn't reply. Rachel, meanwhile, was already ahead. She had frozen all joint accounts that morning, filed a restraining order that restricted Ethan from accessing her new financial institutions, and submitted notarized statements from the notary who unknowingly validated forged documents. Danielle had arranged everything, and Monica, the forensic accountant, had submitted a 38-page report detailing the siphoned $80,000 in structured withdrawals. Rachel's case wasn't just strong, it was surgical. She had quietly become the storm. Friday's hearing was in a medium-sized courtroom downtown, the kind with dull carpet, and judges who'd seen every kind of betrayal imaginable. But even the bailiff seemed to sense this was going to be different. Ethan arrived with a high-end attorney from a corporate firm, polished, expensive, smug. Rachel wore a slate gray suit, simple earrings, and her hair pulled back. Danielle stood beside her documents in a sleek leather binder. Rachel looked calm, almost serene. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, flipped through the initial brief before glancing over her glasses. Mr. Miller, she said this petition includes allegations of document fraud, electronic forgery, financial coercion, and asset redirection. Are you prepared to respond? Ethan stood. Your Honor, my wife is confused. These are standard estate procedures. If there's been miscommunication, it was purely clerical. Rachel didn't flinch. Danielle stepped forward. Your Honor, if I may present Exhibits A through G detailing every unauthorized signature, hidden transfer, and the digital trail that confirms intent. The judge raised an eyebrow. Proceed. Rachel watched as Danielle laid out the evidence one sheet at a time, the notarized deed with a forged signature, the email to Lauren referencing Rachel as handled the deposit trail of missing funds, and a voice recording in which Ethan joked to a friend about cleaning house before the split. Each page landed like a slow drumbeat. Ethan's attorney fidgeted. Ethan shifted in his seat. Once or twice he glanced at Rachel, but she didn't meet his gaze. Then came the text messages. Not all of them, just enough. She's clueless. By the time she figures it out, everything will be mine. You're the future. She was just the setup. Lauren's name was on nearly all of them. The courtroom was still. Even the judge paused for a moment before speaking. "These are not clerical issues, Mr. Miller. They're deliberate, layered actions designed to disenfranchise your spouse financially and legally." Ethan's attorney tried to pivot. Perhaps mediation would be a more productive path, but the judge held up a hand. "Ms. Miller," she said, looking directly at Rachel, "do you wish to proceed with the motion to freeze all assets, nullify the transfers, and challenge the trust on grounds of fraud?" Rachel's voice was steady. "I do." And just like that, the mask Ethan had worn for so long, the charming husband, the stable partner, the provider, fell away. The judge ruled in Rachel's favor. Every document Ethan had filed without consent was deemed inadmissible. A full audit was ordered. Rachel was granted exclusive access to all marital assets until a formal review. The lake house was reinstated in joint ownership pending final division. When it was over, Ethan stood stiffly, his skin pale beneath courtroom lighting. He tried to speak to her outside, but Danielle blocked his path. Rachel didn't turn around. She walked out into the sunlight, not triumphant, but intact. That's what the audience always longed to see. Not a woman who screamed or collapsed, but a woman who calculated, endured, and reclaimed. The battle wasn't loud, the victory wasn't flashy, it was precise, and it was complete. The lake house was quiet again. Not silent in the way it had been with Ethan, tense, muffled, heavy, but quiet in the way wind brushes over water or leaves fall without asking to be noticed. Rachel stood on the porch, coffee in hand, wrapped in a navy sweater that still smelled faintly of cedar. Autumn had begun to press against the trees, and the air tasted clean. She breathed it in like medicine. She was alone now. But she was finally at peace. The lake house had been hers again for months. The ruling had gone through cleanly, and Ethan hadn't fought the reassignment. He didn't have the legal ground or the public dignity left to do so. She'd walked back into the house that first day with a strange sense of reverence, as though returning to a version of herself that had been waiting there all along. At first, she didn't touch anything. Then slowly, methodically, she began to reclaim the space. Not decorate, reclaim. She gutted the old guest room and turned it into a studio. Sunlight poured through its southern windows in the late mornings, lighting up the pale maple floors she refinished herself. She painted the walls a soft sage, added open shelving for fabric swatches and samples, and mounted a corkboard that spanned the entire back wall. In bold block letters across the top, she pinned a sign, "This is what I built." He didn't get to take it. She reopened her interior design brand this time, with a reimagined focus empowering women transitioning out of long-term relationships. Her new clients weren't just looking for furniture. They were looking to rebuild a life, and Rachel understood that intimately. She offered home consultations with one rule: no design decisions made without full financial transparency. She wanted her clients to know exactly where their money was going, not just in decor, but in life. The business name was different now, too. It wasn't Miller Interiors. It was Frame Plus Fire, a nod to what she'd once been, something quietly hung in someone else's life, and who she had become, a woman who burned down the lies and built something warm in their place. She also started speaking just once at first at a local nonprofit focused on financial literacy for women post-divorce. The executive director had reached out after reading a blog post Rachel published titled "The Power of Looking Twice." She agreed to speak at a Tuesday night event held in the back of a community center. It was informal. Just 30 or so women on folding chairs sipping bad coffee and clinging to quiet heartbreaks. Rachel told her story, not all the court details, not all the legal warfare. Just the slow invisibility, the misplaced trust, the signing of things that didn't feel right. The night she heard his voice through the office door. She told them how she stopped being afraid, how she gathered evidence, not rage, how she wore her silence like armor and waited for the right moment to speak. And then she told them what she'd learned. That loving someone should never require you to disappear. That being pleasant is not the same as being safe. that understanding your finances is not optional, it's survival, and that you can be calm and still be dangerous. The applause wasn't loud, but it was real. That night, she went home and opened her email. There were already messages waiting. I've been hiding my own suspicions for years. Today I opened my own account. Because of you, I started tracking my money. I left him. You said exactly what I needed to hear. I found myself. She read each one slowly, tears slipping down without warning. Not from sadness, but from something deeper. Recognition, validation, proof that her pain had not only been endured, but transformed into something that reached beyond her. She still had hard days. Healing wasn't linear. Sometimes she'd wake from dreams of being trapped, stuck in a house where every drawer was locked, every mirror missing. She'd wake up breathless, heart hammering until she remembered she had keys now. She had light. She had windows again. Sometimes she still missed the idea of Ethan, the promise of partnership, the comfort of shared history. But she no longer confused those memories with safety or love. She was dating again, nothing serious, just dinners and walks, people who asked questions and listened to answers. People who didn't require her to shrink. Her favorite mornings were still the ones spent in the studio. Coffee in one hand, paint samples in the other, music drifting from the Bluetooth speaker tucked beside her desk. It was there, surrounded by her work and her rhythm, that she felt most like herself. The revenge had never been about ruining Ethan. It was about reclaiming Rachel. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't televised or thrown like a torch into his life. It was whispered in her survival, in the echo of her new voice speaking to women who felt invisible, in the quiet power of a woman who did not burn herself down for someone else's comfort, but built herself back brick by deliberate brick. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a soft amber glow across the room. Outside, snow whispered against the windows in slow, spiraling patterns. But inside, it was warm, steady. Rachel sat cross-legged on the couch, a leather-bound journal balanced on her knees. A pen moved smoothly across the page, her handwriting neat but loose, like a woman who had finally stopped censoring herself. It had been nearly a year since the court ruling, nearly a year since she had stepped out of the courtroom without looking back. She hadn't dated. Not seriously, not yet. A few conversations here and there, coffees that turned into walks, but she always ended them before they asked for more. It wasn't because she was afraid. It was because she was full. Her life now had weight and color. Her mornings were hers. Her work felt meaningful. Her friendships were real, built not on politeness, but on truth. She had begun to love the quiet again, but not the kind that asked her to disappear. This quiet felt earned. It hummed like respect. She paused her pen and glanced at the fire, the reflection of the flames dancing softly in the window. In the silence, she could still hear echoes of the years she spent being the peacekeeper. The wife who let things slide, who smiled when she wanted to scream, who folded herself smaller so someone else could feel big. She had been quiet for peace, now she was clear for it. She looked back at the journal and flipped to a page she had written weeks ago, one she often reread when the world felt uncertain. I wasn't saved by anyone. I built the ladder and climbed out. No fairy tale rescue, no perfect ending handed to her. Just work. Intentional, gritty, courageous work. Rachel had rebuilt her world one plank at a time. Her business, Frame Plus Fire, had grown beyond what she imagined. It wasn't just interior design, it had become a symbol. Women hired her because she saw more than paint colors and fabrics. She saw their healing, their attempts to make space after grief, after loss, after betrayal. She helped them make homes that felt like them. Not the women they had to be, but the women they were becoming. Her studio now had a wait list, and just last week, her first in-person workshop had sold out in less than 48 hours. The event was hosted in a restored loft downtown, filled with natural light and long work tables scattered with swatches, wood samples, mood boards. But it wasn't just a design class. It was an experience, a quiet revolution disguised as creativity. Rachel had opened the session with a simple question. What does it feel like to take up space again? Women cried. Not because the question hurt, but because it opened something they'd been waiting to express. They cut fabric, shared stories, sketched ideas, and slowly something powerful filled the room, the sound of women rebuilding themselves without apology. At the end of the session, they gave Rachel a standing ovation. It wasn't for the class. It was for the woman behind it, the one who had refused to vanish, who had turned her silence into strategy and her story into light for others. Rachel hadn't expected to cry, but she did just briefly. A single tear slipped down as she smiled, overwhelmed not by sadness, but by the immensity of it all. This life she had now, it wasn't a return to anything. It was a beginning. She glanced again at her journal and wrote a new entry. There is a version of me I wish I had met earlier, the one who speaks with care but never asks for permission, the one who doesn't wait to be chosen. I built her out of ashes and blueprint scraps, and now she builds others. She closed the journal and placed it gently on the table beside her. Outside, the snow had stopped. A soft hush had settled over the lake, the kind that made the world feel suspended in grace. She walked to the window and pressed her palm to the glass, her reflection looking back, not hard, not sharp, but strong. She whispered just loud enough for herself to hear, "You're not broken. You were never broken. You were buried, and you dug your way out." Behind her, the fire crackled. Ahead of her, spring waited. Rachel turned from the window, ready.